Welcome to 6.3 Biodiversity. The goal is to recognize the consequences of losses of biodiversity due to catastrophic events, climate change, human activity, and the introduction of invasive and non-invasive species. This is not an actual Gary Larson fireside, it's a takeoff one, but I thought it was pretty clever too. It says, looks like your whole dinosaur system is wiped out. You really should have invested in some anti-meteor protection. How do you feel about upgrading to mammal OSQ? I thought it was pretty clever. Okay, moving on to our objectives. First objective is to define biodiversity and explain its value. The second one is identify current threats to biodiversity. And finally, describe how biodiversity can be preserved. So let's think about it. What is biodiversity? From multicolored coral reefs to moss-draped forests, variety is the spice of life. Variety in the biosphere gives us something interesting to look at, and our well-being is closely tied to the well-being of a great number of other organisms, including many that are neither majestic or beautiful to look at. So let's think about it. Our first objective is to define biodiversity and explain its value to us. All right. Biological diversity, or what we shorten as biodiversity, is the total of all the genetically based variation in all organisms in the biosphere. What kind of biodiversity exists and what value do they offer society then? Biodiversity exists on 3 levels: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Ecosystem diversity refers to the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes in the biosphere. The number of different species in the biosphere in a particular area is called species diversity. To date, biologists have identified and named more than 1.8 million species, and they estimate that at least 30 million or more are yet to be discovered. This is probably the most common type of biodiversity that you are aware of. Species diversity, all the different types of animals and plants out there. Genetic diversity can refer to the sum of total of all the different forms of genetic information carried by a particular species or by all organisms on Earth. Within each species, genetic diversity refers to the total of all the different forms of genes present in that species. Biodiversity is one of Earth's greatest natural resources, and when biodiversity is lost, significant value to the biosphere and to us, humanity, may be lost amongst it. So biodiversity benefits to society include contributions to medicine, agricultural, and the provision of ecosystems, goods, and services. For example, a wild species are original source of many medicines. Foxglove plants, right here, contain compounds called digitalins that are used to treat heart disease. These plant compounds are assembled according to instructions coded in the genes. The genetic information carried by diverse species is like a natural library from which we have a great deal to learn still. Biodiversity in agriculture is next. Most crops have wild relatives. For example, wild potatoes in South America come in many, many colorful varieties. These wild plants may carry genes we can use through plant breeding or genetic engineering to transfer disease or pest resistance and other useful traits to crop plants. Biodiversity ecosystem services is next. The number and variety of species in the ecosystem can influence the ecosystem stability, productivity, and value to humans. Sometimes the presence or absence of a single keystone species, like we learned the sea otter, can completely change the nature of life in an ecosystem. When the otter population falls, the population of its favorite prey, the sea urchin, goes up. Population increases in sea urchins cause a dramatic decrease in the population of sea kelp, which was the sea urchin's favorite food, or is. Also, healthy and diverse ecosystems play a vital role in maintaining soil, water, and air quality. So objective 1 is to define biodiversity and explain its value. Biodiversity is the total of all genetically based variation in all organisms in the biosphere. Biodiversity benefits to society include contribution to medicine, and in agriculture, and the provision of goods and services to the ecosystem. Objective 2, let's identify some current threats to biodiversity. Human activity today is causing the greatest wave of extinction since the dinosaurs disappeared. Like my picture? The current rate of species loss is approaching 10,000 times the typical rate. That's bad news. As species disappear, the potential contribution to human knowledge that is carried in their genes is lost. Species diversity is related to genetic diversity. The more genetically diverse a species is, the greater its chances of surviving disturbances. So, as human activity reduces genetic diversity, species are put at a greater risk for extinction. Species diversity is also linked to ecosystem diversity. As ecosystems are damaged, the organisms that inhabit them become more vulnerable to extinction. Humans reduce biodiversity by altering habitats, hunting, introducing invasive species, releasing pollution into food webs, and contributing to climate change. Altered habitats. This is what we do also. When natural habitats are eliminated for agriculture or for urban development, the number of species in those habitats drops, and some species may even become extinct. Development often splits ecosystems into pieces, a process called habitat fragmentation, leaving habitat islands. If you look at this chart very carefully, you can see that one of these species cannot survive very well when the habitat's been fragmented. A biological island can be any patch of habitat surrounded by a different habitat. For example, deforestation for housing developments in Florida has led to forest islands. The smaller a habitat island, the fewer species that can live there, and the smaller their populations. Both changes make habitats and species more vulnerable to other disturbances. Hunting and the demand for wildlife products. Humans can push species to extinction by hunting. Some animals are hunted for their meat or their valuable hides or skins. Others, like the green parrot shown here, are hunted to be sold as pets. Hunted species are affected even more than other species by habitat fragmentation because fragmentation increases access for hunters and limits available hiding spaces for the prey, because they have a smaller area to go hide in. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, bans international trade in products from a list of endangered species. Introduced species, or organisms introduced to new habitats, can become invasive and threaten biodiversity. For example, one European weed called the leafy spurge, shown here, infests millions of hectares across the northern Great Plains. Leafy spurge displaces grasses and other food plants and can actually sicken or kill cattle and horses that eat it. Pollution. Many pollutants also threaten biodiversity. DDT, as we talked about before, prevents birds from laying healthy eggs. Acid rain places stress on land and water organisms. Increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is dissolved in the ocean, making it more acidic, which threatens the biodiversity in marine ecosystems too. Climate change. Organisms are adapted to their environments and have specific tolerance ranges to temperature and other abiotic conditions. If conditions change beyond an organism's tolerance, the organism must move to a more suitable location or die. Species in fragmented habitats, such as these forest islands in Florida, are particularly vulnerable to climate change because if conditions change, they might not be able to move easily to a more suitable environment. It's kind of a bad picture. You probably see it. It's the best one I could find. So objective 2 is identify current threats to biodiversity. Humans reduce biodiversity by altering habitats, hunting, introducing invasive species, releasing pollution into food webs, and also contribute to climate change. burning fossil fuels. Objective 3, describe how biodiversity can be preserved then. Let's see what we can do. How do we preserve biodiversity? To conserve biodiversity, we must protect individual species, preserve habitats and ecosystems, and make certain that human neighbors of protected areas benefit from participating in conserving efforts. Protecting individual species first. How do we do that? Well, we have all kinds of people out there wanting to do that. So we have the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the AZA. They oversee species survival plans, which are called SSPs, designed to protect threatened and endangered species. In the AZA captive breeding program, mating pairs of animals are carefully selected to ensure maximum genetic diversity. The ultimate goal of the SSP, the Species Survival Plans, is to reintroduce individuals to the wild. More than 180 species are currently covered by the SSPs. Next, how do we preserve habitats and ecosystems? Global conservation efforts today strive to protect not just individual species, but entire ecosystems. The goal is to preserve the natural interactions of many species at once. Governments and conservation groups work to set aside land as parks and reserves. The United States has a national park, forest, and other protected areas. Marine sanctuaries are being created to protect coral reefs and the marine animals too. To make sure that conservation efforts are concentrated in the most important places, conservation biologists have identified ecological hotspots. Or an ecological hotspot is a place where significant numbers of species and habitats are in immediate danger of extinction. By identifying these areas, ecologists hope that scientists and governments can better target their efforts to save as many species as possible. The next topic is considering local interest. Protecting biodiversity often demands that individuals change their habits or the way they earn their living. It is often helpful to offer some reward or incentive to the people or communities involved. The United States, for example, has offered tax credits to people who installed solar panels or bought a hybrid car. So objective 3 is to describe how biodiversity can be preserved. To conserve biodiversity, we must protect individual species, preserve habitats and ecosystems, and make certain that human neighbors of protected areas benefit from participating in conservation efforts. So, can you define biodiversity and explain its value? Identify current threats to biodiversity? And also describe how biodiversity can be preserved. I hope so. I think so. And there's an interesting picture for you to look at.